This is Billy Kay, welcoming you to the last of our series on Scotland's Black History, Programme 7, It Wasna Us.
Well, I had went to a exhibition in Edinburgh, but it was called It Didn't Happen Here. So it was very Edinburgh, and I thought, in Glasgow, this is going to be It Wasna Us. You know, at the time it was just the popular misconception that somehow Scots weren't involved. It wasn't us, it was the English. It wasn't us, it happened 200 years ago. It wasn't us, it was the rich landowners. There's various versions of this deflection that I've came across since, so it seems to have struck a chord with a lot of people, and it always goes down well with a Glasgow audience, this title.
Sailing from Montrose, there were 4 ships directly engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. The William and Sarah of Aberdeen, the Delight of Montrose, the St George of Montrose and the Success of Montrose. But there were up to about 30 more ships involved in the tobacco trade with Virginia, which was of course very much dependent upon slave labour.
The naming of slaves is interesting too, and one of my colleagues who works on the project with me on the Highlands, Andrew McKillop at Aberdeen, he's actually just found lists of slaves owned by people from Kinloch Moydart that are actually named after local villages.
From Kinloch Moydart to Kirkcudbright and from Angus to Argyll, in recent years, historians have uncovered more and more of Scotland's hidden history. Dr. Stephen Mullen of Glasgow University.
There has been an explosion of interest in the Scottish role in Caribbean slavery, particularly around 2007, which is the bicentennial of the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. So that really initiated a real national explosion. You know, it was in London as well, you know, Bristol and Liverpool, but I think in Scotland we had more to catch up. You're seeing new academic works, you know, my own research, Michael Morris, Ian White's book was very important, Tom Devine, the new textbook as well. The Commonwealth Games was really important as well. The Empire Cafe with Louise Welsh. There was also the play Emancipation Acts. So what both these events did, they took the academic research, literary work that's going on, and they were taking this to a bigger, wider audience. Sometimes there were 400, 500, 600 people at these events. The academic work was percolating into popular culture.
Dr. S. Carly Keogh of St Mary's University, Nova Scotia, for example, is leading a project which reveals the Highlands as intensely engaged in the slave economy as any other part of Britain.
Our role now is to open that up and to start to think about how the Highlanders fit in with this broader, more British perspective of imperialism, colonialism, and exploitation of vulnerable groups.
It goes against one of the narratives of Highland history, of post-Culloden, of Highlanders being victims, right through to the clearances, again Highlanders being victims. But here, it's a very different image of Highlanders we get.
Oh, it's a completely different image of Highlanders, and some people are very uncomfortable with that because it does challenge perceptions of victimhood.
David Alston has faced some criticism. He's been heckled when he speaks about the Highlanders as slave owners. I think in Scotland we only seem to do hero or victim history. And the role of Scots as profiteers and perpetrators in Caribbean slavery, it doesn't sit nicely with this romantic self-identity. You know, in many ways, if you're at the cutting edge of the academic research in Scots and the Caribbean and you're talking about the exploitation, the expropriation of labour, sexual abuse in some cases, you know, you're challenging preconceived assumptions about what the Highlanders were or what Scots were as a people at the time.
Being in Britain, part of the British Empire, we have to remember, brought Scotland tremendous opportunity and Scots enormous wealth. Very few are going to turn their back on that by considering the ethical implications of many of their activities.
Ironically, most of the new charitable institutions which emerged in the 18th and early 19th centuries to improve life in the Highlands, from the first modern hospital, the Northern Infirmary, to the new academies in Inverness, Tain and Fortrose, all obtained substantial proportions of their funding from the slave-based plantation economy of the Caribbean. This was how Tain Royal Academy appealed to exiles in the islands.
The Sons of the North in every corner of the world are invited to support a seminary calculated to raise their countrymen to a higher pitch of dignified attainment. The sons and daughters of benevolence are solicited to bestow their might in aid of their children of those dusky hills and tempest-beaten valleys, where the hospitable right was never refused to the stranger or the destitute, in aid of the sons of Caledonia, whose heroic deeds have filled the world with admiration and raised their military renown.
Stirring stuff, you
It
know.
does. It makes you, when you
Hail
read
Caledonia.
something, when you read something like that, you can't help but feel something, you know, which is good.
It is, but then you think the background to it of these people exploiting people.
Another aspect to the story are the medical professionals who go out to the West Indies trained at Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. Some of them are brought onto the plantations to help get sick slaves better, but some actually become businessmen on their own, and they buy slaves who are ill or sick, nurse them back to health, either rent them out or breed them so that they can have more slaves. There is no end to the tragedy of this story, right? And every stone you turn over, you find something else.
When slavery was abolished, for example, the Glasgow and Argyllshire house of John Campbell Senior and Co. received £73,000 in compensation for the loss of their property, their slaves, the largest payout in Scotland and sixth largest in the whole of Britain. Strong kith and kin networks among Gaels here were reproduced in the West Indies to such an extent that an English novel of the period suggests that Gaelic was the passport to career advancement. Sheila Kidd of Glasgow University.
The main character, this Marley, has headed off to Jamaica to find out what's happened to his family's estate there. And when he arrives, he's travelling with a friend who's a Campbell. His friend is immediately offered employment by another man from Argyll, but it turns out there's no employment for Marley. In the novel, Marley is told that, to my certain knowledge, he has 2 or 3 vacancies, but it is not his practice to employ any person, whatever, unless they are from the Highlands and can talk Gaelic.
Another important part of the West India merchant and planter culture in Glasgow at the time was the gentlemen's clubs. A really prominent example that the Campbell family frequented was the Gaelic Club. One of their members, Alexander Campbell of Hall Yards, at one of the meetings of this powerful fraternity, he brought a turtle, a taste of the Caribbean, to the first meeting, which was on the 11th of July in 1798, in the Black Bull Inn in Argyll Street. They would have played whist, they would have drank rum, they would have socialised. This was a very, very exclusive club.
One Gaelic dictionary published here received 60% of its funding from Jamaica, while another got 35% from Grenada and St Vincent alone. The Gaels also created a home from home in the Caribbean. Sheila on Dougal MacNicholl, a soldier who wrote songs and kept a diary of his time in Barbados and St Lucia.
We get some insights into the lighter side of life in the islands. For instance, he tells that when visiting one family, "Fo aanbrachkish go aim geniroch, vimit markoch, from breakfast to dinner time, we'd be riding or playing games in the house, or eating sugar cane, or tearing about the house until night time, and all night we'd be dancing and singing."
The family firm of John Campbell Senior and Co. He promotes some of his sons, as well as Mungo Nutter Campbell, who's his nephew, but he's also his son-in-law and his cousin's son as well. So I've called it the almost incestuous relationship of the sugar aristocracy. There's a high degree intermarriage between the clans, if you want to call them that. But there's 2 young, as I've called them, sugar princes, White Mungo Campbell and Black Mungo Campbell, but they're descended on both paternal and maternal lines from the sugar aristocracy.
Grenada and Carriacou were as much clan territories as Islay and the Black Isle. They appealed for funding for Fortrose Academy.
The uncommonly handsome manner in which the inhabitants of the island of Carriacou have acted on this occasion and with very few exceptions, all the respectable sons of Scotland in it contributed towards the amelioration or improvement of so excellent an institution. And Carriacou is tiny. It's very, very small, and I think he was pretty much able to get money from almost every Scot there.
For a long time, the seaports of Angus were also guilty of denial. But recent research is revealing substantial involvement in Montrose, while Hospital Field House in Arbroath recently curated artist Graham Fagan's show from the Venice Biennale, which explored the subject creatively. Michael Morris of John Moores University, Karen Salt of Aberdeen University, Lisa Simmons of Dundee and Angus College, and Laura Simpson of Hospital Field House.
We have here a book borrowed from the National Library of Scotland collection called Narrative of an Unfortunate Voyage to the Coast of Africa. It's written by Thomas Smith, sailor from Arbroath, and it was published locally here in 1813.
This is a remarkable example, really, of something that's been buried in the archives in Scotland for centuries, I suppose. And what he describes is really a kind of international story as he travels, first of all, to Dundee and then down to London. So he goes down to Africa, down to Cap Mount, Pittenenny, down St Paul's River, down that kind of Guinea coast. He describes a very dramatic rebellion that takes place on his ship. And then they change ship and go to Cape Coast Castle and then on to the Caribbean. He then comes all the way back up to Amsterdam and then finally back to Arbroath.
The trade was concealed because basically it happened out of sight, out of mind. So people loading the ships in Montrose would be loading salted fish, finished or processed tobacco. They would then sail to Europe and sell these goods in Europe. So leaving Montrose, to anyone watching and loading these ships in Montrose, it's all very above board and decent. They would then pick up goods in Europe, then they would sail down to the Gold Coast, sell their goods there, and then they would pick up and buy slaves. And that's where the money was made. And the ships, of course, were not built for passengers or people. The conditions would have been, I think, pretty horrific.
The Negroes, as soon as they are taken on board of any of the ships, they are all circumcised, and still, to add more to the misery of these poor, wretched creatures, they are loaded with heavy shackles of iron, and every 10 are chained together, fast by the necks, hands and feet, and marked with a burnt iron on the right hip. This is cruelty in the extreme.
Everyone will be somehow impacted by this series of brutality, even if you don't have slaves. And I think trying to talk and think and work on this work now, there's a very interesting process where some distance from it. They just go, that's not me, has nothing to do with me, that's a completely different somebody else's history. So they get this kind of protected kind of shield on. And others are traumatized from it, will cry and actually feel so deeply empathic and emotionally connected to it.
He describes how slave ship sailors separated enslaved men from enslaved women. And he says, you might think that this was to be decent, but no, in fact, this was in order that women would be more vulnerable. They are subject to the wanton and unrestrained licentiousness of the crew.
The abuse continued when the ship arrived in Kingston and for the rest of the women's lives.
Gentlemen came on board and purchased the best-looking girls and took them away with them. What they intended by such a procedure as this was more than I can fully explain.
This was actually one of the very first letters that I came across when I started doing this research 5 or 6 years ago, and it's a letter again from Alexander Bailey to his brother in the early 1750s. It talks a lot about the sexual exploitation of female slaves. These were women who had absolutely no power over their own bodies, and they were bought and sold, and they were beaten and abused. And this was at the end of the letter, and he's just closing off, and he's talking about women and his perception of slave women, and he writes, But I protest the Negro wench is much handsomer and cleanlier in my eyes in all respects, and for all the purposes you please, and I'm sorry to observe that in all appearance the married men think so too, for, to their honour be it spoken, there is not 1 in 40 of them but keeps 1 or more of them in chintz and calicoes out of the field, and for what purpose I leave you to judge. As a historian, we're trained to read all of the evidence and keep an open mind, but it's kind of hard when you come across sources like this because you know exactly this is a rape culture that's going on, and it's something that's difficult to speak about. But basically these women are kept for the sexual gratification of the white plantation owners and the plantation workers. They had very little authority over their own bodies. And, it's one of these topics that we really need to start engaging with, in a way almost to give these women back their own sense of self and their own power by acknowledging that it happened. This is one of the things that I find the most difficult about the research in this area, because you'll just be reading a letter and then you'll come across something like this and you will have to stop. I think any human has to stop and take a breath.
John Langlands owned the Rosebery Coffee Plantation in St Elizabeth Parish, Jamaica, and he also owned half of the Malvern estate. So in 1817, John Langlands owned 263 slaves. Now on this list, we have people named Dundee, we've got another man called Angus, a boy called Aberdeen, a baby called London, aged 4 months, and his mother is called Princely. I think the things that got to be the most were the babies and the children, to think that they were born on these plantations and what hope did they have. And I think the biggest thing for me is the fact that they were given these names. There is nothing at all about where they come from in Africa. Their heritage has been completely eradicated, and that for me was really the most heartbreaking thing of all, I think. Their whole history was just wiped clean. It was erased by slavery.
The women in particular were seen as breeding machines, and often they weren't seen as human beings. They were seen as producers of babies who would grow up to be slaves. And in fact, in the evidence you see when somebody is writing down all of the assets that they have or all of the things that they've got on their plantations, they will put slaves right next to cattle and pigs and sheep, as though there was no difference.
Carly Keogh, with material from an excellent educational booklet, Landscapes and Lifescapes on the Highland Connection to Slavery. At Glasgow University, there's also a project on runaway slaves led by Simon Newman, which shows how the taint of slavery reached the streets of Glasgow. The author of It Wasna Us, Stephen Mullen.
One in Glasgow, a young woman, Arona, is from Dalkeith. She runs away. She had a green dress on and a collar with her master's name. It would have been a slave collar, so this would have denoted ownership by the master and would have given his contact details. So this young woman would have been in Glasgow city centre. I don't want to use the comparison with a dog collar, but this is the analogy that could be made, because the enslaved people would have been regarded as subhuman property in some cases.
Because we called these people merchants, Glasgow with its merchant city, nobody ever questioned what they were merchants in. Although we're surrounded by these historical facts, the names that we give to them disguise the roots of their industry and where they made their fortune from.
The artist Graham Fagan, along with a dramatic bronze sculptured rope tree with a noose, central to Graham's installation is a video of a version of Burns's song The Virginia Slave's Lament, composed by Sally Beamish, produced by Adrian Sherwood and performed by classical musicians from Scottish Ensemble, as well as renowned reggae artists from Jamaica. I asked Graham how the singer Ghetto Priest had reacted to the Burns song.
I'm going to try and tell a story without crying. I went down to Adrian's studio to do the recording and the filming. There was lots of my reggae heroes coming in and out, and everybody was super friendly, everybody was saying hello, except Ghetto Priest, who stood in the corner of the recording studio rocking back and forward. And I thought, that's a bit strange. It felt a bit awkward for me, but nobody else seemed to be bothered. And there was lots going on in the studio. There was an engineer at a mixing desk, and I could hear the lyrics of the Slaves' Lament, and I could hear different bits of music, and I thought it was coming from the engineer at his mixing desk. And then the engineer turned around and said, "Would anybody like a coffee?" So he put all the sliders down on his desk and went to make a coffee. So the music that I was hearing faded, but I could still hear the lyrics. And Ghetto Priest was still in the corner rocking back and forward. And then it twigged. The lyrics I was hearing were coming from the man in the corner rocking back and forward. And he kept singing, and he realised the music had dropped a bit, and he eventually turned round and he saw me. He's like, "Graham?" I was like, "Yeah." And he came over and he said, "Your man Robert Burns was born to write this song, and I was born to sing it."
It was in sweet Senegal that my foes did me in fraud, for the land of Virginia, Virginia, oh, torn from that lovely shore, and must never see it more. And alas, I am weary, weary, oh, torn from that lovely shore, and must never see it more. And alas, I am weary, weary, oh.
A brilliant fusion. And finally, as we approach the end of the series, at last the story of a positive Scottish contribution to Jamaican history. John Magee talking about his dad, the Reverend William Magee from Shettleston.
My father had been a friend of Sir Alexander Bustamante's, the Jamaican Prime Minister, and just before independence, the Jamaican people still hadn't agreed on a national flag. Originally, the Jamaican flag was a tricolour, green, black and gold. However, it was deemed to be too close to the flag of Tanganyika at the time, and it was causing a little bit of concern. So my father said to Sir Alexander, "You know, Jamaica's a Christian country. Do you not think the flag should have a cross in it somewhere to signify this?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean? What do you have in mind?" So my father drew out the Scottish flag, and he then painted it in green, black and gold into the saltire design.
Was that just automatic? Your dad being a proud Scot, he would immediately think of the St Andrew's Cross as the basis?
Absolutely, 100%, yeah, and he was a very proud Scot. And Sir Alexander took that to the House of Representatives on June 1962, and it was unanimously accepted as the design for the new flag of Jamaica. And it's hard to believe that that was something like 2 months before actual independence. However, it did all go through, and they did manage, and independence was a huge time in Jamaica. It was fantastic.
So as a young boy, a teenage boy, you were seeing the Jamaican flag, St Andrew's Cross all over Kingston?
Absolutely, that's the way it was, and it was just lovely, and it's a beautiful flag. And I think possibly because it's got the St Andrew's Cross in it as well, that it has that special link with me as a Scotsman, and I just love it.
And on the back of that wonderful story, a committed Christian, David Pott, founded the Flag Up Scotland Jamaica initiative, seeking to balance historic wrongs with future rights. Graham Campbell is the chair.
On 1st of August 2014, Caribbean Emancipation Day, we launched Flag Up with the members of the Jamaican athletics team, the Jamaican High Commissioner, the Chamber of Commerce hosted us, and that's interesting because the Chamber of Commerce is the successor body to the old Slave Masters Club. And it calls for twinning, recognition of the cultural and historical links. Reparations, yes, but not in the monetary sense.
Jamaicans today are proud to be Jamaican. And they've created their own culture, and they've created their own nation, and they've done very well. And I would like to see, through the Flags Up initiative, I would like to see trade between Jamaica and Scotland, because Jamaica and Scotland had a link for so long. Just to stop it doesn't seem right to me.
Jamaicans should feel a sense of ownership and connection to that. We care about what the Scottish diaspora is. We are the most Scottish country outside Scotland anywhere on earth. There are over 300 place names in Jamaica which are Scottish place names. 1/3 of the white people who colonised Jamaica were Scots. That's why people like me have Scottish names, because 1/3 of our population has Scottish surnames and ancestry. And the question is whether we recognise it. It changes how we as Scots see ourselves as well as how Jamaicans should see themselves. Yeah. So because of that family link, I think it's really important that we make the most of that connection.
Driving around Angus today, are you reminded of connections?
Always. In terms of the Rossi estate, for example, Horatio Ross, all that money that his father made and invested in the estate, and now there is investment companies that are linked to these slave traders' names. That largesse is filtering down, and these people are still living good lives on the back of the slave trade.
I mean, you have to imagine there are certain groups of people where families have burned their records. Yeah. You know, they don't want to be associated with enslavement in any capacity. Yeah. So what looks like it should just be go in the file folder and pull it out and then just link it up together, you're also dealing with a whole bunch of individuals, sometimes corporations who don't want stuff to be known, banks, all sorts of folks who are kind of protective of all of this. Yeah. We've got to tread quite carefully into this to realize this may have real-term implications for people, especially if these reparations things move forward.
The Coutts family, they had 2 local ships, the Mary and the Prosperous, to deal with and trade in tobacco. The money that was generated in Montrose, because he was one of the most successful traders in Montrose, was then filtered down into Coutts Bank. It permeates all of the establishment and all of society. It just needs to be scratched away at the surface to find.
This has always been a difficult subject, but one we have to confront as a people determined to acknowledge every aspect of our history, not just those where we were either heroes or victims. It wasn't us, it was, and we should never forget it.
The more research I do in this area, the more I become convinced that no part of Britain was untouched by the money that was made there, and that we better do the best we can to find out more about it so that we don't repeat these mistakes, or that we at least become aware of them so we can't ignore them.
This is a period of reassessment for Scotland. Part of that, and a crucial part of it, I think, has to be a relationship with empire and race, elements which have been overlooked far too often in the past. And this is really kind of key, because what we're thinking about at the moment in Scotland is what kind of future is it that we want. And as we're beginning to try to imagine some kind of a better future, I think we really want to think about the way that we treat other people around the world as part of that. So Paul Gilroy talks about that what we're doing here is nurturing some of the resources that are going to be necessary if non-white Europeans are to dwell peacefully in Europe in the 21st century. And I think that idea of kind of dwelling peacefully is one that I would want to take forward for a better, more enlightened future for Scotland.